On September 1, 1983, a Soviet fighter jet shot down a passenger plane. 269 people lost their lives, including a United States Congressman. The plane was Korean Air Flight 007. It had strayed into Soviet airspace by accident. The Soviets didn't ask questions. They fired missiles. The wreckage fell into the Sea of Japan. The Cold War almost became World War III. This is the story of one of the deadliest accidents in aviation history, and the mystery that still surrounds it. Subscribe, because this story will make you question everything. September 1st, 1983, the height of the Cold War. Ronald Reagan was president. The Soviet Union was the evil empire. Both superpowers had thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at each other. Tensions were at a peak. Just months earlier, Reagan had announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, and the Soviets were convinced America was preparing for nuclear war. It was into this atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that Korean Air Flight 007 took off from New York's JFK Airport. The flight was routine, a Boeing 747 carrying 269 passengers and crew, business people, families, tourists. They were headed to Seoul, South Korea, with a refueling stop in Anchorage, Alaska. Among the passengers was Larry McDonald, a Democratic congressman from Georgia. He was traveling to Seoul for a ceremony marking the 30th anniversary of the U.S.-South Korea Mutual Defense Treaty. McDonald was known as one of the most conservative members of Congress, fiercely anti-communist, suspicious of the Soviet Union. He had enemies on both sides of the Iron Curtain. His presence on the flight would later fuel conspiracy theories. At 4 a.m. local time on September 1st, Flight 007 took off from Anchorage for the final leg to Seoul. The flight path was supposed to take the plane over the North Pacific, well clear of Soviet territory. The route, known as Romeo 20, was carefully designed to avoid Soviet airspace. Soviet airspace was dangerous. The Soviets were paranoid about American spy planes. They had shot down aircraft before. Any plane that entered without permission was in mortal danger. Flight 007 was supposed to stay at least 17 miles from Soviet territory at all times. It didn't. Within minutes of takeoff, Flight 007 began drifting off course. The plane was equipped with 3 inertial navigation systems, sophisticated computers that should have kept it precisely on track. But something went wrong. Instead of flying the planned route, the Boeing 747 drifted steadily northward. It crossed into Soviet airspace near the Kamchatka Peninsula, one of the most sensitive military areas in the entire USSR. Kamchatka was home to Soviet nuclear submarine bases, missile test facilities, and fighter interceptor squadrons. American spy planes regularly probed its edges, testing Soviet radar and response times. The Soviets detected the intruder immediately. At Soviet Air Defense Headquarters, radar operators tracked the unknown aircraft. It was big, it was flying at high altitude, it was heading deeper into Soviet territory. They assumed it was an American spy plane, probably an RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft. The Americans flew these missions regularly, collecting electronic intelligence on Soviet defenses. Fighter jets were scrambled. MiG-23 interceptors took off from Kamchatka, but they couldn't reach the intruder before it left Soviet airspace and flew over the Sea of Okhotsk. The aircraft was now in international airspace. The Soviets tracked it, waiting. Then Flight 007 made another mistake. Instead of continuing on a safe course, the plane turned and headed directly toward Sakhalin Island, another highly sensitive Soviet military zone. It was flying straight back into Soviet airspace. The Soviets couldn't believe it. If this was an American spy plane, it was being incredibly bold. If it wasn't, well, they weren't taking chances. At 5:56 a.m., Major Gennady Osipovich took off in his Su-15 interceptor. Osipovich was a veteran pilot with thousands of hours of flight time. His mission was simple: intercept the intruder and identify it. He climbed to altitude and acquired the target on radar. Then he saw it, a large aircraft with blinking lights flying at 35,000 feet. Osipovich later said he knew immediately it was a civilian plane. It had navigation lights on. Its silhouette was clearly a Boeing 747, not a military aircraft. But his orders were clear. The Soviet chain of command was in motion. Regional commanders, convinced this was an American provocation, were demanding action. The intruder had been in Soviet airspace for over 2 hours. It had to be stopped. Osipovich was ordered to force the plane to land. He fired warning shots, cannon rounds with tracer ammunition that should have been visible to the Korean pilots. Flight 007 didn't respond. It continued flying. Did the pilots see the tracers? Did they understand what was happening? We'll never know for certain. But they didn't change course. They didn't respond to radio calls. Time was running out. The aircraft would soon leave Soviet airspace again. At 6:26 a.m., Osipovich received the order he had been dreading. Destroy the target. He armed his missiles. He acquired the Boeing 747 in his targeting system. He pressed the button. 2 R-98 air-to-air missiles streaked toward Flight 007. At least one hit the aircraft, detonating near the tail. Shrapnel ripped through the fuselage. The Boeing 747 went into a spiral dive. For 12 agonizing minutes, the plane fell from the sky. Passengers would have experienced terror beyond imagination, the cabin decompressing, the plane spinning, the ocean rushing up to meet them. At 6:38 a.m., Korean Air Flight 007 hit the water near Monoran Island. All 269 people on board were lost. The Soviet Union initially denied everything. They claimed no knowledge of any incident. They suggested the plane had simply disappeared. They accused the Americans of fabricating a provocation. But the United States had evidence. American intelligence had been listening. They had intercepted Soviet military communications in real time. They had recordings of the pilots, the ground controllers, the order to fire. 5 days after the shootdown, the Reagan administration released the tapes to the world. The recordings were damning. They captured Osipovich reporting, "The target is destroyed." They captured Soviet commanders discussing the attack. The world was outraged. Reagan called it a crime against humanity. He accused the Soviets of knowingly shooting down a civilian aircraft. He called the Soviet Union a society that wantonly disregards individual rights and the value of human life. The Soviets, caught in their lies, changed their story. Now they admitted shooting down the plane, but claimed they thought it was a spy aircraft. They accused the United States of deliberately sending a civilian plane into Soviet airspace to test their defenses. It was a monstrous accusation. It was also, many believed, projection. The truth is more complicated and more tragic. Flight 007 was not on a spy mission. The passengers were real. The deviation was almost certainly an accident. The most likely explanation, pilot error combined with navigation system failure. The Boeing 747's autopilot had multiple modes. One mode, heading mode, simply maintained a constant magnetic heading rather than following programmed waypoints. Investigators believe the pilots accidentally left the autopilot in heading mode after takeoff. The plane flew a constant heading instead of following the planned route. The crew never noticed. How could experienced pilots make such a mistake? How could they fly for 5 hours without realizing they were hundreds of miles off course? It seems impossible, but pilot error has caused many disasters. Fatigue, distraction, complacency, all can lead to catastrophic mistakes. The crew of Flight 007 had multiple opportunities to catch the error. They had 3 independent navigation systems. They had radio navigation aids. They had radar that should have shown them over land instead of water. They missed them all, and then the Soviets shot them down. The aftermath reshaped global aviation. President Reagan ordered the GPS system, then under military development, to be made available for civilian use. Never again would aircraft have to rely solely on inertial navigation. International protocols for intercepting civilian aircraft were tightened. Pilots were trained to recognize interception signals. Procedures were established to prevent misidentification. The tragedy of Flight 007 made flying safer for everyone who came after, but it didn't bring back the 269 people who lost their lives. The conspiracy theories began immediately. Some believed the official story was a cover-up. They pointed to Larry McDonald, the anti-communist congressman, and suggested he was the real target. Others believed Flight 007 was on a spy mission, that the CIA had deliberately sent it into Soviet airspace to trigger a Soviet response and gather intelligence. Still others believed the Soviets had captured survivors and were hiding them in gulags. None of these theories has ever been proven, but none has been conclusively disproven either. The secrecy of the Cold War, on both sides, left room for doubt. The full truth may never be known. The Soviets eventually found the wreckage. They located the main debris field and the flight recorders, the black boxes that might have answered all questions. But they kept them secret. For years, the Soviets denied having the black boxes. Only in 1992, after the Soviet Union collapsed, did Russia finally hand them over to international investigators. The cockpit voice recorder revealed the pilot's last moments. There was no indication they knew they were in Soviet airspace, no indication they knew they were being intercepted, no indication they understood why missiles were suddenly tearing their aircraft apart. Their last words were screams. The families of the victims sought justice for decades. They sued the Soviet Union, then Russia. They sued Korean Airlines for negligence. They lobbied governments for answers. Some received compensation. Most received nothing but grief. The lawsuits revealed new details. The investigations produced new theories. But closure remained elusive. 69 children lost their lives on Flight 007. Entire families were wiped out. Communities around the world were devastated. For what? A navigation error? Soviet paranoia? Cold War tensions? 269 people paid with their lives for a mistake and an overreaction. The shootdown nearly escalated the Cold War into something worse. In the weeks after Flight 007, both superpowers went on heightened alert. Reagan's rhetoric was fiery. Soviet leaders were convinced America was preparing for attack. Just weeks later, in November 1983, NATO conducted a military exercise called Able Archer. The Soviets, already paranoid, believed it might be cover for a real nuclear first strike. Soviet nuclear forces went on alert. The world came closer to nuclear war than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. We survived, but it was a near thing, and it all started with a plane that drifted off course. Major Gennady Osipovich, the pilot who fired the missiles, lived with his decision for the rest of his life. In interviews years later, he expressed no remorse. He said he was following orders. He said he did what any Soviet pilot would have done. But he also admitted he knew it was a civilian plane. He knew there were passengers on board. He fired anyway. I had to, he said. I had my orders. The eternal excuse of soldiers who do terrible things. Osipovich passed away in 2015. He never faced charges. He never apologized to the families. The Soviets who gave the orders faced no consequences either. The Cold War protected them. Then time protected them. Justice was never served. September 1st, 1983. 269 people boarded a plane thinking they were going to Seoul. They ended up in the Sea of Japan, victims of Cold War paranoia and human error. The passengers included a congressman who fought communism until his last breath, children who never got to grow up, families heading to new lives, students, business people, tourists, people from 12 different countries. They deserved to land safely. They deserved to live. They got a missile instead. This is the story of Korean Air Flight 007, a reminder that in the Cold War, ordinary people paid the price for superpower rivalry. A reminder that mistakes on a plane in a command center can cost hundreds of lives. A reminder that 269 people are still waiting for justice. Subscribe for more Cold War history. Share this video so Flight 007 is never forgotten. Comment, accident, or conspiracy? This video is for the 269 passengers and crew. They were innocent. They were victims. They deserve to be remembered.